You may be better acquainted with the first reading than the second. You might know the parable Jesus tells. It's not, I suppose it's not his best known parable, but you might know that he does tell this parable in response to the man's question about inheritance. So a man comes to him and he asks Jesus, and in fact he calls him teacher, mediate between my brother and I. For our father, grandfather, perhaps, has passed, and now we need to decide how is the inheritance going to be divided according to our Jewish law. And teacher, we need someone like you to decide. And Jesus will have none of it, will he? He simply says, don't ask me to judge inheritance. Instead, take care that you do not work for greed, because all kinds of greed lead away from God. All kinds of greed. You might even say greed for the right things lead away from God. We'll get back to the Jesus story. The interesting one here is the reading from Ecclesiastes. As far as I know, Ecclesiastes is only read about twice a year in church. So we follow the lectionary that you can find in the journal as well. And the lectionary tries to take you through the whole Bible in about a 3-year period. But in that whole 3 years, on only 2 Sundays, does Ecclesiastes appear. The one is normally New Year's Day, that very well-known poem about a time for everything, a time for birth and a time for death, time for building, time for tearing down. And then this reading from the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes begins with the famous words, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." When I grew up, I thought a vanity was a case in which my mum kept her makeup. But of course, the word has more meaning than that. And perhaps there's a different way to interpret the actual word there that the teacher in Ecclesiastes is using. You can say vanity, or you can say meaninglessness, futility. Think about that. Futile. Futile. Everything is futile. Everything is meaningless. The word itself, hevel, is difficult to translate. About the best we can do is probably that the meaning translated into English is something like breath or vapor. Blowing a dandelion apart. It's there and then it's gone. It's like every breath you take. It's there and then it's gone. Ecclesiastes is saying everything you can own, everything you can aspire to, everything you can accumulate, every single thing you can secure is like a breath that is there and then it's gone. That's it. He starts the book that way. Then he gives us some information about himself, the writer of Ecclesiastes. He says, I was king over Jerusalem. So we know a few things. We know, one, he was very rich and very powerful. And probably when writing the book in old age, looking back on his life. And so right before our reading here from Ecclesiastes, he tells us that in my younger days, I thought I will find the things worth living for. I will go out of my way to find whether you find meaning and permanence in, for example, pleasure. Is that the thing that you should live for? Pleasure, sensual pleasure, pleasure of the senses. And he concludes, no, that's meaningless as well. Then he says, well, what about hard work? What if you work very hard and you build very many things that will outlast you? Is that the way to make your life meaningful? And he concludes that's useless as well. That's futile as well. And then he says, well, what about wisdom? What if you spend your life applying yourself to the getting of wisdom. Surely that must be worthwhile. And then he concludes that it's not. That even wisdom, although it might be better than many other things, is like a breath. It's like vapor. It's there, and then it's gone. And then we have this reading where he says over and over and over again, I toiled and toiled and toiled. And the toil here is not simply working for a living. It is to represent all his labor in pursuit of finding meaning. And look how many times it appears. I hated all my toil, all my work, all my applying of myself in seeking wisdom. I hated it. For all the toil that I toiled under the sun. Why? Because when I die, I'll leave it to someone who doesn't deserve it. And even if they deserve it, the one who comes after them might not deserve it, because they might have no wisdom. Someone else will be master over all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom. It's vanity. The end of verse 20. I gave my heart up to despair concerning all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave it all to be enjoyed by another who did not toil for it, did not sweat for it, did not bleed for it. This is vanity, and it's a great evil. What do mortals, it doesn't matter who they are, what can mortals gain from all the toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For all their days are full of pain, and their work is a vexation. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This also is vanity. It pays to remember that the man writing this lived a very different life to you and I. Not just the time and place in which he lived, which certainly was very different, but he was king. He had at his disposal anything he could have wanted. He is in a very real sense very different from you and I, because he probably never needed anything in his life. He lived in luxury and in riches. You've seen that very good piece of contemporary wisdom on the internet. It says, the only people who say looks don't matter are pretty people. You've seen that? The only people who say money doesn't matter are rich people. Now, the teacher here, King of Jerusalem, telling me that money is meaningless sounds a bit hollow perhaps. But don't worry, luckily there's someone else talking today as well. But boy, does he have some stuff to say. So if on the one hand you have Ecclesiastes, King of Jerusalem, a man who never wanted for anything, telling the rest of us who have to work that all toil and all work and all accumulation is meaningless. If you have him on the one side, on the other side you have a carpenter from Nazareth who lived without a roof over his head and without a second cloak and with no riches and no possessions, and as far as we can tell, no desire to have any. But when he speaks, he gives us the same message as Ecclesiastes. Again, the parable. The land of a rich man, a man who already had enough, produced abundantly. Doesn't that sound like capitalism? Where the rich are always getting richer and always having more. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Well, that's not true. He has place, but it's not big enough. So he does the very wise thing. He does the sensible thing. He does what you and I would do. He says, I will do this. I will pull down my barns, and then I'll go to the bank and say, look how big my crop is. Give me an advance so I can build bigger ones. And he builds bigger barns so that I can store all my grain and everything that my grain allows me to buy and to acquire and to accumulate and attach myself to. And when I have done this, I will say to my soul, soul, interesting way of talking to yourself, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And yet that very night God will come to you and say, you fool, tonight you will die, and another will gain all you have toiled for, all you have worked for. It does not profit a man to accumulate earthly riches. It profits a man to accumulate riches with God, riches toward God. So if on the one hand we have this very rich king who lived in luxury telling us that earthly things pass away and are not worth all our toil. And on the other hand, we have Jesus of Nazareth, who lived homeless, without possessions, telling us that all earthly goods are meaningless and pass away and not worth your toil. What are we to make of those of us who live in between, who might have enough to get by, but don't have enough to sleep well at night? What are we to make of all this when the inflation keeps rising and the interest rate keeps rising? And the papers tell us we're in for 2 more years of hurt. How do we make sense of the Bible's persistent call for us to have less and less and less when everything around us is shouting more and more and more? I think it's important to remember and to say that in this parable, Jesus is not judging the rich man because of his richness. It is not wealth that is being judged. It's not luxury that is being judged. It's the little words in green that are being judged. It's the I. It is the employment of all your wealth and toil and wisdom and skill simply for yourself. When the call of the gospel is so clearly to give away, to live for others, to love your neighbor with the love of self. He's not called a fool because of his good business decisions. He didn't simply have an abundant harvest by chance. He worked to prepare his soil to give him that harvest. He pulls down the barns that are too small and puts up. That's a sensible thing. That's not the thing that's judged. That's not the thing that's on the table here. The thing that's on the table is doing this for his own enjoyment, for his own pleasure, for his own luxury at the expense of all other things. That's the thing that Jesus is drawing our attention to. And I think that's important to say because often in church it may sound to you, and it sounds sometimes to me, like we are not allowed to have too much. We're not allowed to have a second home or a second car or a second jacket or a second pair of shoes. And if you do, you feel guilty about. But I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue, the thing that is judged, is the act of turning that second home, car, jacket, or pair of shoes into the thing you value most. That is what Jesus will say is foolish. That is what Ecclesiastes will say is meaningless. Because remember, all things pass away. Even the most permanent thing you can imagine passes away, and you will pass away. And your children will remember you, and your grandkids, and maybe their grandkids. But then you too will be gone, with all your wisdom, and all your experience, and all your life, and all your knowledge. What did we begin with today? Did we say, what was the question, Joan? How do you get enough? How on earth do you get enough? How do you make sure that you have enough for what's coming? Well, there are two ways. Next one. There are two ways to get enough. One is to continue to accumulate more and more. The other is to desire less. It goes further than that. This is Gilbert Chesterton. He was a Catholic writer, but he's very good, and he's good reading as well. He says you can have enough. It's possible. You can accumulate more and more and more, and one day you'll hit that standard you set for yourself. You can. You can do it that way. It is going to require a lot of toil, a lot of vexation, a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and sleepless nights. You can choose that. Or you can learn to desire less. And I think this is true when we're talking about the easy things like money and possessions, but this is true in relationship as well. You can drive other people into the ground by your desire to have more and more and more, or you can learn to desire less. This thing, this breath, this singular breath that's there and then it's gone, from Ecclesiastes. I don't know what to make of it. Is that what all this comes to? Is that the singular lesson of this great book of wisdom? Is that nothing we really do matters? Because if that's true, what should we do? What is there to do? Many people read Ecclesiastes and they despair. Or even more people don't read it in the first place, because if you read it, you will despair. But there are also in Ecclesiastes moments, glimmers, of the antidote to despair. And so right after all that talk about how he hates toil and hates work and leaving things to other people and everything like that, Ecclesiastes has this to say. So we ended in verse 23. This is 24 to 26. There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat and have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and heaping, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a chasing after wind. The green and the yellow are different colors for a reason. The toil is the word we spoke about a moment ago. It is that blood, sweat, and tears. It is that laying out of yourself, that emptying of yourself in pursuit of a goal. But the work of gathering and heaping, accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, that's a different word. And that we should rather consider not something from the hand of God as a blessing, but something of a punishment from God for your desire to have more and more and more. Thomas Aquinas, great Catholic theologian from the Middle Ages, he had a way of describing this, because in his time, as in our time, and as in the time of the Bible, there were those who had more and wanted more, and there were those who had less and wanted less. Aquinas said, we make a big mistake in church when we think that riches and wealth and prosperity is some kind of blessing from God. In fact, it's a punishment. To the one who desires more and more, it's almost as if God says, well then, be careful what you wish for. To you I will give the never-ending work of acquisition, the never-ending strife of accumulation. And one day when you're gone, just maybe, one who pleases God will come to inherit it. Perhaps riches, wealth, blessings, perhaps they have their place. But perhaps Ecclesiastes teaches fundamentally that it never stops unless you can learn to eat and drink and find enjoyment in your toil, in your work. You see, the man in Jesus' story, we're jumping between the two today. The man in Jesus' story has the abundant harvest, and he builds the barns, and he's going to take it all in. And what does he say to himself at the end? He talks to himself, he says, soul, now you're good to go. Now you're set for life. What can you do? Eat, drink, and be merry. So there's nothing wrong with that. Ecclesiastes says that's the best you can hope for. The best you can hope for, if everything is but a breath, is to eat and drink and be merry. But how you get there matters. If you want to get there at the end of a long life of accumulation and wealth and luxury, you will find yourself dissatisfied. But if you realize that you can get there here, now, in this moment, simply with the clothes on your back and the money in your bank account, now, then you will find delight, joy, and something of God's giving nature. And so in both these passages, we can almost play these things off against each other. We can say that the world around us teaches us desire, the desire for more, the desire for better. But God requires detachment, not desire. God wants us to hold our possessions lightly. Because the more we try to hold on to them, the more we will lose them. The more we desire, the less we have. The more we detach, the more we enjoy. We can say that the world will try to convince you that you must try to have everything. You must try your best, your whole life long, to have as much as you possibly can. And you cannot have enough. There is no such thing. Greed is good. The gospel will teach you there's only one thing that matters. Relationship with Christ the Lord. That is riches toward God. Instead of desire, seek detachment. Instead of having or wanting everything, seek the one thing. And if you do this, then you will look around at the world around you and you will realize how meaningless everything is. And the world will say to you, despair. Give in to your despair. And God will say to you, no. Delight. Delight in what you have. For this is from the hand of God. And maybe especially now, as we go into times of economic uncertainty, maybe especially now, we must choose detachment, not desire. The one thing, not everything. Delight, not despair. Delight in what you have to eat, in what you have to drink. In another passage, he will put a bit of a spin on it. Ecclesiastes, he'll say, this is in Ecclesiastes 3. He says, the best you can do is to eat and drink and enjoy your life with the woman you love, or with the man you love. He says that's what it comes down to. And if today you leave here and you go to a beautiful Sunday roast, enjoy, delight. And if you go to a stale slice of bread, enjoy and delight. And whether you travel home in a new car, or whether you walk home, and whether your home has 5 bedrooms or 1 bedroom, may you know that it is from the hand of God that you can eat and drink and be merry. That you can eat and drink and delight in God. There's a great insistence, we'll end with this, there's a great insistence in the Bible, from the beginning to the end, to make us understand this point, because we get it wrong so often. To really make us understand that you cannot find meaning and purpose in possessions. In fact, the funny thing happens, if you try, those things begin to control you and rule you. The best you can do is to have your car or your house or your meal, but to detach from it. And when you detach, when you desire less, you can delight more. When you desire less, you can delight more. Let's pray in answer to that, a prayer of few words. A prayer we know so well. A prayer that asks us to ask God to give us simply our daily bread. I think, worship team, if you come to the front, then we will stand, pray the Lord's Prayer, and immediately sing in praise and worship of God.